Okay, so we're going to try to use the format of keeping this at 20 to 30 minutes. I think I can. It's be a little talky while I do it, but then we have an exercise at the end and we'll continue it. And I have a confession, and I'm going to say this because I want y'all to consider this in the background and see how you react to how I say what I say. Excuse me, I am interested. So, some of you who are in the Amplio community of practice session don't know this conversation has been going on, but there we got about 50-50. I love that we have a lot of new people here. It's really good. But I have been trying to just express what's needed without being negative about what's going on in the industry. But I've gotten fairly convinced that the lack of systems thinking is a direct problem, and in fact is the problem that's at the root of almost everything wrong that's going on in agile adoption and things. And it's had that mostly we take two approaches to agile. One is a team up approach, which totally contradicts system thinking, and the other one is a component based approach that's safe, of course, which doesn't contradict systems thinking, except they don't do it well, and it contradicts Alexandrian design of systems. So we have these two bad choices in a sense. And I think if we had systems thinking, things would get better. So when I wrote this talk, and I just wrote a blog on it as an outline that I published, uh, what I started to do was look at what's wrong. Okay, as those of you in the ACES program know, and a lot of other people have inferred. And we had talked about maybe not doing that, maybe just coming from what's needed. So I actually, in the middle of it, I kind of shifted to that. And then I said, no, this doesn't work. And I'll tell you why it doesn't work here. It doesn't work because it's too abstract what's wrong. I think people need to see and have it pointed out. So I don't believe I have any energy that I have exhibited in the past, more than once, more than twice even. Uh, but I have just laid the facts out. And I guess I'd like you to keep that in mind. Is this a good approach? Or should I have tried going back to just saying what's needed and not mentioning anything? So I notice I'm a little bit in a dilemma on this myself, but I actually feel comfortable with what I did here. So anyway, so the need for systems thinking is what this talk is. I will try to be done no later than 8:35, but I'll probably be done before then. And then we're going to discuss it and talk about some examples of what's missing and what the problems are that are caused by it. So, so where we are is um, a lot of Agile is based on Scrum. Whether they're doing Scrum or not doing Scrum, I don't really care. That's not the point. The point is there's a pervasive thinking that's out there that you can do team-based Agile, grow from teams, and go. Agile adoptions are often started by having a simple team adoption, typically using Scrum, which it's not bad for a lot of the times, very successful, but it doesn't deal with some issues. Now, Scrum is basically, it's a simple framework. It's designed for small cross-functional autonomous teams creating a new product. If you read the new product development game by Takeuchi and Nonaka, this is basically what they're talking about. The new product development game. It's about a team building a new product. It's easy to start, short iterations, short planning cycles, daily pivots, weekly reflections of how we're doing, some clarity on roles. It basically got to popularity because XP, which actually I know Scrum predated XP. XP kind of came out in 99, Scrum came out in 95. But at the early days of Agile, it was actually XP, but then we couldn't get people to test first and pair program. And Scrum was like this easy thing to do because you could just wrap it. And I found I could get a team up in Scrum in an hour if they met the requirements. I did that. I mean, it's not a speculation that you could do that. That's actually what I did several times because it is very simple and it is really nice. And when it applies that way, it's a great way to start because you don't need any more than that. Except what I'm doing isn't really Scrum because it's the tip of the iceberg of a much deeper knowledge I have. Okay, here's the reality. This is not 2001. Okay. And it's funny, we talk about dog years and people years, but internet years, AI years, it's going to get more accelerated. It's not going to get less accelerated. We're not hitting a peak. We're about to go up again. We've been on this rising curve and it's about to get steeper.
Organization is actually rewarding and creating systems that actually.
Okay. So Yeah, now I guess you should unmute unless you want to talk, then unmute. That'd be good because I was trying to wonder what was going on. Okay, so we moved beyond the team. The problem is twofold. One is teams are no longer cross-functional and autonomous. I mean, once you have two or three teams in a group, you're almost always interacting with those other teams, almost always. They're also often involved in multiple projects, so they get interrupted a lot. They need to learn how to work in a system of other teams, teams that have their own focus. This is important. In other words, it's not a group of teams working together, even when it's on one big project. I've seen this many times. I remember I have a case study. I called it dynamic mobbing, I think, or dynamic feature teams. And we had 7 teams working on the same product, which was a flight control and communication and weapons control of a military aircraft. They were all working basically on keeping that aircraft in the air. But each one had its own focus. Each one had its own manager, and each one was working toward their benefit. And what happened when I came in is I showed them how they had to work together and gave them a way of learning how to work together by using basically lean at the time, which incorporates a lot of flow and stuff. So, so you need to learn how to do that. And that's not in the knowledge base of a team-based approach. It's not in this team-centric approach that we have in the Agile space. So ironically, Scrum-based Agile, I would suggest, and I say Scrum-based because not everything is Scrum, and I'm not worrying about if it's Scrum or not Scrum. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, are you basically taking the idea I have a cross-functional team, I have daily pivots, like with a daily stand-up or whatever you want to call it, retrospections, have a customer, have a few roles. And what's happening, it's the challenge is now multi-team agiles between the teams. The challenge with multi-team agile, what we're facing, is not within the teams. Scrum is created purposely incomplete to enable a simple start. That's fine, but it doesn't help us go to the next level. And this is generally true of Agile in general, is what I'm saying. So I'm just using Scrum as kind of the example. No guidance how to move to where it wasn't designed for, because you need theory for that. See, what happens with experience is you learn how to do things where you are and where you've been. But the only way to move into a new place, you have 2 ways to do it. One is if you don't have a theory of understanding, you have to try things. You have to experiment. You typically will fail a lot. That's where the fail fast idea comes from. But if you have a model of understanding, you can move into a new situation without a lot of that crap, without a lot of that waste, without a lot of failing. Now, you do have to learn because you're not always right, but you can move forward in a solid way. I call this learning fast because what you're doing is you're basing on the model you have and you learn where it applies and where it doesn't apply and you improve the model, as opposed to failing fast where you're running experiments. Also, coordination across teams, which is what's done to fill in the gap. It's not enough. Actually, coordinating teams takes more work for the teams. And you say, oh, well, that's okay because we need more teams. There's actually are ways when you take a system thinking approach called alignment that doesn't take any extra effort. Literally does not take any extra effort. In fact, it makes things more efficient. So systems thinking is a different perspective. We've had non-systems thinking agile. I'm not saying agile's dead. I have never said agile is dead that I can recollect. If somebody points me to it, I'll change the post because it's not dead. The vision of agile to me is as alive as ever, but the implementation of it needs a new perspective. And to me, that new perspective is systems thinking mostly, and then some other details based on that. Basically, attempting to solve an organizational problem with a team solution is like Sisyphus rolling the rock up the mountain. Sisyphus is the Greek, Zeus, I think, punished him for stealing, cheating death twice. But now the rest of his life, he's got to roll that block up the mountain. And that's what we're doing. And it's hard, but systems thinking is the way out. Okay. So I'm going to give you some insights. By the way, I'm not going to explain all the details of systems thinking here. What I'm trying to do is create the opening as to why it's important. Okay, and then we'll give some insights into what you do, and we can talk about that uh, when I'm through with what insight is. Okay, so Deming, just give a little bit of background on Deming, because a lot of people I don't know. It's to me, if we went back to Deming's thinking and added a little bit to it, we'd be so further ahead than we are now. And there's a lot more to add. But Deming was the American who actually assisted the U.S. in the war effort of World War II of manufacturing American military goods. Okay. He and Short were the two main people who kind of created the mindset. And the reason he's not at the top of the management cycle is most of the people he taught were women. During World War II, most of the men were at the war, and most of the women were the managers in the factories and stuff. And then when the war ended, the men came home, took over the factory, screwed it up, and the women went into the families. Now, this is reverse sexism, so please nobody accuse me of being sexist except for the benefit of women, because we'd have been so much better had they kept their jobs and the men stayed home. But that's not what happened. Uh, so the thing is, the people Deming taught were kind of lost at some level, and then of course the chauvinism and all that came into play. Besides, Deming went out to Japan because actually he was called out there by I can't believe the general who took over Japan. What's his name? The Philippines guy. He's an American general.
MacArthur.
MacArthur, yes, thank you. MacArthur was in charge of the occupying forces, the United States forces in Japan, and he needed radios built well and couldn't get them built by the Japanese. So Deming was called out by the U.S. military because Deming was known to the U.S. military and taught the Japanese how to build great radios. And then other companies in Japan, hey, notice this guy's good. Let's go listen to him. They were kind of in need. And that's how the Japanese came up to being good manufacturing, because back in the 40s and 50s, they weren't, but they followed Deming's methods. And then it took years and years, decades, before Deming is reasonably followed to some level, but not so good. So Deming knows something about creating systems. And yes, it was in manufacturing. And no, you cannot take it straight from manufacturing into software. So if you want at the question time, I can talk about that. But one of the things Deming said is he talked about systems. He said systems have to be managed. They don't manage themselves. Left to them own, components become selfish, independent profit centers and destroy the system. Everybody's competing against everybody else. The secret's cooperation between components toward the aim of the organization. By the way, if you're going to cooperate toward the aim of the organization, the inference is you must know the aim of the organization. We cannot afford the destructive effect of competition. He's talking about internal competition. This means now, if you're not having everybody, but you say, well, I've got a group of teams working on a product, then they need to know the aim of that product, the aim of this group of teams. This is called alignment. This is not coordination. It's cooperation with alignment. Okay. Now, there's something else Deming said, but I can't beat him to it. Experience without theory is blind. And theory without experience, I think he called it nonsense. So that's the other part of the quote. Nobody is saying theory by itself is good. I don't know anyone, none of the people I quote have ever said it. Deming goes a little further again. Experience teaches nothing. In fact, there's no experience to record without theory. Without theory, there's no learning, and that is their downfall. People copy examples and they wonder what is the trouble. They look at examples and without theory, they learn nothing. In other talks of Deming, he talks about how what you have is a model of understanding, and you try something and you see what happens and you correct the model. And that's how you learn, by looking at something, doing it, studying the result, and then acting on it. This is called the PDSA cycle. You probably heard it. And it's this kind of, Chris Arger has called it double loop learning. One loop is, hey, how are we doing? And the other loop is, how are we working, in a sense? How do we challenge our assumptions? In other words, the first loop is, how are we doing according to the way we think we should be working? And the second one is challenging how we think we should be working. In other words, there's no immutability here. We can change how we're working together based on that second loop. And Deming talks about that. That's affecting the model. That's very, very, very important. So what is systems thinking? Okay. Akoff is one of my heroes here with systems thinking. He's just so astute and concise and clear and sensible. And I wouldn't say I'm an expert with Akoff. I kind of pull from Akoff and Reinertsen and Goldratt and Tom Gilb, you know, and Alexander and how to build them. So, but Akoff's a really good person. There's a lot of YouTubes out there to watch. And Andrew, if you want to, Andrew Townley is a great expert. He knows more about Akoff's work than I do. If you want to put in the chat some places, if you have ideas, you can do that because you're broader on this and deeper. So successful problem solving requires finding the right solution to the right problem. We fail more often because we solve the wrong problem than because we get the wrong solution to the right problem. You know, there have been quotes by Senge, the author of The Fifth Discipline, which is about systems thinking. And it was one of the two books where I learned systems thinking, mostly, I guess, from him, also from studying Deming in the 80s. But he says something like, you know, how we look at the problem. Actually, he says, you know, how we look at the problem is the problem. We have to, Einstein said we can't solve the problem with the same thinking that got us here. There's a lot about how solution inertia kills us. Okay. Our ability to solve a problem is limited by our conception as what's feasible. This is why I hate the complexity thinkers who are kind of invading the agile space and saying, oh, it's too complex. Well, the way it's being looked at makes it appear complex, but there are other ways of doing it. And systems thinking is the foundation for that. I'm not going to go into inherent simplicity today with Ellie Goldratt from The Choice. Highly recommend that book. But once you get the idea of systems thinking and you look to see how things are working in it, you see that it isn't as complex as it looks. You rarely improve an organization as a whole by improving the performance of one or more parts. The only way you would do that is if somehow you found the one part that was really causing all the problems. So theory constraints does allow you to do that, but then you got to do it over again and over and again and over again as a constraint move, and that actually takes a systems thinking view to find that one part. Okay. Systems are defined by the relationships between the components, not the components themselves. This is far-reaching thinking. Because what this means is if I make all my teams great individually, doesn't matter. I have to make them great working together. Okay. And this is a great example of it. If I may take the best parts of the best cars and put them together, I wouldn't have a car. I'd have a pile of junk because none of the things would work together. See, if I said, oh, I needed to change from a gasoline powered car to an electric car, and I just say, oh, I'll just put an electric motor in. No, it won't even run. Certainly won't work together. Carness exists in the system as a whole. This is the need for business agility. A good reference, by the way, resource is Evan Lieburn's Business Agility Institute. He's really sharp, and I really love his work. So the essence of systems thinking, I'm boiling it down big time here. Systems defined by the relationships between its components. Fixing one part of the system without attending to the rest of it is not necessarily going to help. That is, local optimizations are not always helpful. Like they're not unhelpful necessarily, except they take effort away to do local optimizing that might be better affected, might have a better effect on the organization. Okay. Systems causes most of the problems. This is actually a big thing. The system causing most of the problems tells us two things. First of all, management of the system is needed. Deming already told us that. But the other thing is when something goes wrong, stop blaming the people. There's this endless cycle in the Agile space, and it is particular to the Scrum world. I mean, I look at why some Agile do this and some Agile don't. I don't hear Kanban people blaming management so much, but I hear Scrum blaming them all the time. Just go out on LinkedIn. And the reason is because there's not this awareness that the system is causing the problem. So if something goes wrong, you got to blame the people. So it's not surprising that managers go blame the team, that managers blame the people. And the people know it's not their fault, even if it hasn't been explicitly stated in their head. They know it's not their fault. So they're getting blamed. So they'll just blame management back. Why? Because that's what's called being a human being. You ever get somebody mad at you for doing something you didn't do and you just get right mad at them back? That's called being a human being. That's normal. I mean, I'm not saying it's good, but it's normal. So we have this loop. There's another endless loop. So we need to fix the system. By the way, this can remove fear. We talk about fear in the space. See, when you're in the space, if something goes wrong, you're going to get blamed. You're going to be afraid of being blamed. Your parents taught this pretty well. I mean, most parents. I mean, there might be a few exceptions. I know my parents taught me well that if I did something wrong, I'd get blamed. And that I was now a bad person. So now I had fear. Oh, my parents aren't going to love me. And you think I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. This is deep rooted in us that when we do something wrong, eventually, if you go down to it, this and this and this and this, eventually get to, I'm going to die alone and unloved. It has this primal fear in our unconscious, our subconscious. Can help us break up silos by looking at the whole, because we recognize we have to look at the whole thing. So the benefits are phenomenal. When you take, it tells us where to look. It tells us we have to look at it holistically. Systems thinking says we don't need to work individually, we need to work as a whole, and somebody needs to manage this. By the way, this is the role of management, not to manage people, but to manage the system. We can remove fear by working together at all levels, and we can break up silos by working across things. Okay. So the role of management is to shift from managing teams to improving the systems within which teams work. I find it very ironic that this was laid out in an article in 1988 by Nonaka, one of the co-authors of the new product development game in 86. Nonaka and Takeuchi wrote the new product development game on which Scrum is based. And I have never heard, never, the middle up down, towards middle up down management referred to by any Scrum thought leader. And what I find interesting is you have these two pieces that were presented as necessary to be effective. One was here's how teams work, and here's how management works. And it just emphasizes the focus on the team. Okay. Knowing the system is at fault avoids managers from blaming the teams, and then the teams blaming the managers back in an endless cycle. This is another Sisyphus cycle. Goes to the Einstein insanity, and he wasn't the first one. I think Ben Franklin said it actually, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. The only place where that makes sense, if you ask me, is having another cup of coffee. Why we think the fourth cup of coffee is going to work, I have no idea, but I'm going to keep doing it anyway. But other than that, it's insane. Okay. So I'm actually done. I just laid the background here. Okay. And I intentionally was short on this, and I have all sorts of, I mean, I could do this talk for hours if I pulled in all the information. But what I wanted to do, and this is what, for those of you who are new in the Amplio community practice sessions, these sessions are, and I know I blasted along, I guess I'm excited because I have a lot of passion on systems thinking. The more I've been looking at it, the more I think not having it is the cause of much of our problems, even most of our problems in the Agile space. And by the way, I'm not talking about transforming companies. People are always talking about transformation. You know what? Some companies will transform, most won't. But you can make them a lot more effective, and you can make them a lot more fun to work in, and you can make them a lot more meaningful. And to be candid, I'd rather get most everybody changed that way and not worry about a few amazing companies or a handful of companies that are truly amazing, you know, like Semco and some companies like that. So what I want to do here is let's have a conversation. So I'd have no more slides. I want to have a conversation about systems thinking and two questions that I think give you an insight into it. And then I could talk about solving things. So if you have questions, you can interject them. Well, how do I do this? How do I do that? But reflect, how many of these are caused by the actions of your team? And how many of them are caused by the situation the team is in? Okay, so now you can unmute yourself, raise your hand, just talk, whatever. Tell you what I'm going to do while you're thinking, because we find in the ACE program, this is a technique. I should have set this up. Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to set up a Miro board, not a Miro board, it's a Lucid Spark now. While you're thinking, I'm going to set up a board where you can just put stickies down because that does seem to work better for a lot of people. Here, I'll give you the link to this in a minute. I'm going to use the Amplio Foundations board. I'll give you the link to this in a second. This board is actually something where myself and the aces are building up like different pieces of what's needed, like first principles and things, and we run some exercises like this. You know, like what are the values and excuse me, oops. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come down here and just go down here over the left. I'm going to set up a frame called systems thinking. Oops. I'll put these questions there so you can see them. And I'll give you the link to this. Now, all you got to do to get something on here copy link, duh. I just put it in the chat. So let's run this here. Just click on that. You should get right here to where you see this. And the way to do it is simple. Just double click and you'll get a sticky showing up. See, like right here, double click, bam, how about that? Now type in your answer to those questions. And anytime somebody wants to talk, just unmute and talk. And if you have a problem, put something in the chat. Yeah, actually, Sergio, he more than 70 years later. I learned him 40 years later, but he'd already been going for 30 years. He was even going before the war effort, obviously. It is amazing. See, one of the biggest problems with Agile's perspective is we all think we invented it. No. The arrogance is amazing. And feel free to ask me questions about what we do in certain situations. Otherwise, we're just going to do this. Yeah, just a couple more minutes, and I'd like to talk about these and make a couple other comments.
Our next speaker.
I thought it was that one. Okay, so finish what you're doing and let me give you a question. I'm not saying systems thinking will answer all these. By the way, I didn't say systems thinking is sufficient. Um, in fact, lean, which is based on Deming and systems thinking, added some things to it. I just put that up here. Lean builds on Deming, but he added that the primary purpose was learning. You get this not when you read most books about lean, but when you read Taiichi Ohno's book, The Toyota Production System. Uh, you get, and he says this outright, that his situation at the time was he was very proud of his country, which had suffered a humiliating and disastrous, catastrophic defeat, and he was wanting to show that the Japanese could be great manufacturers. Uh, I remember reading this. I was in awe of this guy's commitment to his people. And the thing is, they had labor, but they had unskilled labor for manufacturing in some ones. And they had equipment. Somehow equipment had survived. That wasn't Toyota's problem anyway. They had equipment. They didn't have trained people. That's the primary thing. And he introduced actually two things. One was just in time and build the quality in, which he called stop the line if something went wrong. And the reason you stop the line is because if the system is causing the problem, you're going to keep making those mistakes until you fix it. Although they don't always stop the line. If the guy can fix it before the error goes down the manufacturing line, they would let it go, but they'd know, let's look at the end of the shift. Let's figure this out. Now, I want to say something interesting because I remember when I read the book, The Toyota Production System, I remember thinking that he left something very critical out in his book. And that book was Deming. He doesn't mention Deming. He doesn't talk about systems thinking. And I attributed this to why bother? Because at the time of the creating the Toyota production system and writing the book, the Japanese knew very well who Deming was and what systems thinking was. And I figured he just left it out because he figured anybody who read the book would know this. I happen to have studied Deming before I studied lean. I actually kind of studied the two a little bit at the same time in the 80s, where I was studying Toyota. It wasn't called lean yet. But then later, a few years ago, it turns out there's some memoirs of Ono's where he said he intentionally left important stuff out in his book because he didn't want the United States to grab it and then become a better manufacturer than the Japanese. And I read that article. I said, oh, well, this is funny. I knew he left it out. I didn't know why. I thought he just assumed people knew. But of course, this was the whole problem is when you look at how Chrysler and GM and Ford tried to implement lean at first, it was a disaster. And the reason it was a disaster is they didn't take the systems thinking perspective he was coming from. They took the idea of limiting manufacturing work in process. So, they just clamped down on how many things, but they didn't have a stable system. So it was just bad. And Ford, with the Ford was it their probe, I think it was, they started doing some of the Toyota production system, and they discovered all these errors in the process. Oh, this doesn't work. Look at all these errors. What they didn't notice was that they always had those errors. Now they were discovering them sooner, and they made the wrong assumption that, oh, this thing is causing all these errors. And they didn't notice that that's, yeah, it wasn't causing the errors. It was creating the visibility of the errors. So it took the American manufacturers a long time to figure out what that missing piece was. So what I want to do here is I want you to look at what's been written, and you can ask questions, is I want you to go through these, and I want you to, and I'm not saying all these can be solved by systems thinking, because to me, what we have now is, I think Peter Merrill, no, it wasn't Peter, I think it was Wolfram Mueller, who talked about the physics of flow. And by the physics of flow, he's really talking about the rules that are there. This is a combination of flow, the theories of flow by like Don Reinertson, lean, basically what came from Toyota but isn't Toyota anymore own. It stands on its own. I don't mean the Poppendix view of lean. As great as they did to get it intro, they still come from manufacturing, and lean stands on its own in software and product development. Lean product development is a bit different than lean manufacturing. And so the physics of flow, which is a combination of flow, lean, and the theory of constraints, to me, that defines it. So systems thinking may not do it, but when you add this, I'll bet everyone can be solved. So read, see how you can relate to it on your own. So I'm making an assertion here. I'm saying pretty much all these can be assisted by either systems thinking or something built on systems thinking with flow, lean, theory of constraints. But I'm not going to tell you how unless you ask. I'm actually asking you to provide your evidence for it, in which case you'll believe it, or I'm asking you to ask me, and then we can have a conversation. So go through that, see if it's okay. Very nice, Martin. I might connect the dots here. I have to pull in some slides from other places. This is from theory of constraints. I mean, what is theory of constraints? But it's basically inherent simplicity. Oh, that's interesting, Thomas. That's correct. It's good. Are there not questions? I'm trying to leave you guys time to talk, and I'm not hearing a lot of conversation here, so I'm not quite sure if this is boring or not effective or what. Yeah, we lost.
What do you mean by the middle up down
Yeah,
management?
I was
You've got
actually looking for a slide that talks about that, but let me tell you what I mean by that. So middle up down management is something that was this article that came from Nonaka. And what he's saying is the role of management is to uh look at, because middle managers he's talking about, is to look up in the value stream to see what it is that's needed. You know, this is typically executives, but he's not talking so much the hierarchy is up the value stream, what's needed, what's the purpose. And then he looks down to the development group to see how to help them do it. So what you've got is your managers are in the middle looking up and down, and they're responsible for creating the environment within which people work. And this is important. Basically, he says that the role of management is managing the system, which mirrors what Deming said systems must be managed. In other words, you don't manage the people. You don't manage the people, you manage the system the people are in. You don't see this much in the Agile space. It's mentioned a little bit safe, but then they go into more things about safe. People like, people don't need management. They don't really talk, which is true per se, but they don't talk about how do you manage uh, this environment. This is where value stream management comes in. Value stream management is one of the best ways to look at things. Does that help?
yes. Again, what percentage of organizations give the managers that expectation of doing
Like
that?
almost nobody.
And so why is that? Again,
Okay, now
I
you're
do
getting into another.
organizational change management, so I'm trying to say, where are the gaps? How can we close them?
Okay, now that's a different question, and it's a great question. So let's talk about that since we're not getting other questions from people. But why is it that these great ideas don't take place? Well, a lot of it comes from a quote by Ellie Goldratt: "A comfort zone has more to do with understanding than it has less to do with control than it does to do with understanding." Making changes and breaking out into new territory is something that can be fearful for people. So it's just a lot easier in some ways. It's a lot easier in some ways for uh, people to just kind of stick uh, to this simplistic view of things. And why that has happened is uh, basically, we've over the last 20 years, there's been this hard sell that you need to go agile. Scrum is the easiest way to start, and people have bought into this. And what Edgar Schein says, you don't, we don't, we don't talk and think about what we see. We see what we're able to think and talk about. So what happens is uh, that we don't talk about this. So if you don't talk about it, you don't see it. You really can't figure out what's going on. And this is really a lot of the problem is that nobody is really giving this as a conversation. And there's another problem with this. The corollary to we don't think and talk about what we see what we think and talk about, is if it's not in our vernacular, then it's not in our sight. In other words, we don't talk about it. We don't even have words for it. Management evokes the idea of managing people, and we're saying, oh, we're not doing that. No, it doesn't mean that. But our vernacular managers of the system is not there. I'm actually trying to figure out maybe how to is there another term for management of the system? I guess this is managers should be value stream managers, or that's not quite right either, because they're not really managing the whole value stream. Here, I've got a slide I'm going to make a copy of here.
It just seems like so obvious. If you think like the movie Ford versus Ferrari, if
Yeah.
they didn't have their cars, the absolute best system, they weren't going to win. And so it just,
It's kind of obvious, but you've got to give up the fear. This is, by the way, the reference, or I'll make a snapshot of this. Fear is what drives a lot. Fear, Agile has created this self-perpetuating cycle of fear that has us take simplistic thinking and use that. I don't know what else to say.
why does Agile promote fear?
Because it puts you in situations that you're not going to get out of, and it keeps you there because it says here's a simple solution, and it's kind of not your fault. It's like my first job was with IBM when I left MIT, and one of the cool things about Big Blue at the time, it was called, the IBM equipment was not the best. Everybody knew it wasn't the best. But IBM was amazingly good in supporting the software, I mean, the hardware. And nobody ever got fired by buying IBM because you could blame IBM if something fell. Well, everybody buys IBM. It wasn't my fault this didn't work. So it's a way of avoiding responsibility when you do Agile and you take the top things. Now, I think this is changing. If you look at surveys, more and more people are going off on their own and building their own, but frameworks are what most people use. Actually, Amplio, and this is something we're getting ready to do. If there are other things, Karen, that are, to me, totally insane. Look at how Scrum and Safe have predetermined solutions without first looking at what is the problem. How do you investigate what the problem is? Well, why do we do that? Because by taking something off the shelf, if it fails, it's that solution that everybody else is doing's fault. It's not my fault. In fact, I'm going to show something as we're kind of in the middle of working on this. And I've just been really getting how this is where we need to go. Part of systems thinking says that that you better find out what the problem you have is. And creating in the and here's just a final view of it. This is maybe complex. Maybe I shouldn't put this out, but I'm going to put it out anyway. Is that we look at the system as kind of a value stream here, and there are different bands of people working, but it's all feedback going around. And what happens when you look at this, you can use a picture like this. I'm going to go to the Lucid Spark board we use. You can take this, and instead of starting the conversation with why you need Scrum or why you need Safe or why you need to go, well, you could go out all on your own. What you can start looking at is where are your problems? So you can bring this up and people can put, oh, we got a challenge here, 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 we got a challenge here. And people can understand this. And now you say, okay, those are my challenges. How do I solve them? Karen, this is even more of a crazy conversation to have. Why aren't people recognizing you got to see what your problem is before you find a solution to it? Yet notice that most people are just taking pre-packaged solutions. Okay, let me come back to this board. Here we go. And I've lost visual again. This happens to me, and then I can't see how to get it back. I've got the list of participants. So raise, oh, somebody's hand is raised. Sorry, I didn't even see that because I had that screen. So is somebody's hand up? If it is, just go ahead and talk. Oh yeah, Susan.
Yeah. Well, and also on an organizational basis, look at what managers are asked to spend their times on. They do annual performance reviews. They set up the three top things you're supposed to do. And if you're the top firefighter for a manager, you always get interrupted and sent off on other things. And then you get a bad review because you didn't meet your objectives. Why wouldn't managers be spending some time looking at the ecosystem people are working in rather than spending all this time doing performance reviews, which at best are a waste of time?
Well, and performance reviews, notice, are simply we're evaluating the individual pieces of the overall system. So they're not aware of systems thinking. Now, why aren't people aware of systems thinking? Well, actually, take a look at this. Susan, that was such a great example. Thank you. When something goes wrong, is the manager going to say, oh, it's my fault, I'm not inspiring my people, or it's my fault, I'm not giving my people the right environment? No, they're going to blame their people. That's part of the purpose of evaluation reviews. Oh, this person's got to improve. It's not my fault. Now, that's not set, but that's the feeling. That's the emotions.
Mhm.
So what keeps this in place is emotions. And this is something I'm kind of late to the game on, I admit. So I know a lot about how human beings are. I had a lot of training in it, went through it in the 80s in the self-help group. I actually helped promote those as kind of a hobby. I don't know, hobby, but I wasn't paid for it. I was just found it fascinating, and it shifted my ability to be with people. I used to be an incredible introvert. I know some of you probably have a hard time believing that, but I was. Uh, I couldn't look at anybody in the face. I would look down at their shoes. Really, it was ridiculous. And I broke free, and then I started looking at how people were and how we're triggered, and we filter and we transform what we hear. So part of what we have here is the human nature. The way we are is what's keeping this in place. And logic is not going to break us out of it. If you've got an engineering base, I talked to Tom Gilb about this once. I asked him where he had the greatest success. And he said with companies where they do engineering, because they have this attitude that you have to look at what works, not just what your emotional state is. The problem is people who base their logic on emotional state don't know that's what they're doing. They think they're basing it on logic, and most people do base on emotional states. So what I'm planning to do, I'm working toward this, is the idea is there a way that if you can get people to see that they have more control than they believe they have, then that can reduce the fear, and that can make an emotional attachment to this new way. This is why I get so hung up on the arguments of complexity thinking. Oh, it's too complex, we can't figure it out. And I'm saying, well, wait a moment. There are dozens of things. I've distilled it. I'll go on the page, I'll show you where remember I said this is on the foundations page. I've distilled this. There's more than 10 principles. Don Reinertson has hundreds of them. But I've distilled it into a few things. These are complicated, possibly, relationships, and here are factors to use. But basically, it's like this. If you're not following these, you're causing damage. Now, you might not see all the damage, and there might be, excuse me, I got horrible allergies this season. And it might be that there are complex issues that are causing more damage that you don't see. But it's like having holes in the boat. If you start patching them, the boat might still be leaking, but you're making improvements. And as you make improvements, you start seeing some of the things you didn't see before. And this is important. This is why what we need to be doing is using the things we know. Use the systems thinking, cause and effect that's present in the system, governing it all. This is what Goldratt talks about in The Choice. This is what Goldratt talks about in The Choice, that he calls inherent simplicity, and I've distilled it down in knowledge work, because it's very narrow, to say this is what we call factors for effective value streams. So we need to get to this point of where the emotional attachment is to understanding instead of following. But right now it's about following. Okay.
So do you have an example of, you said you're planning to do, is there a way for people to see they have more control than they think they have?
That's what we do in the ACE program. Yeah. So that's basically my whole ACE program is that.
Okay.
And that's really, you're basically getting every month something like 3 or 4 days of training that are recorded you can go to, and it's $150 a month billed annually. So, it's, in fact, I'm about to start promoting in a different way. And I'm glad some ACEs are here to hear this, which is that we need to go from frameworks to figuring out our own solutions. But we don't want to go from the ground up. We want to go from what we understand works. This is not a 2-day workshop. This is not a 5-day workshop. This is an ongoing process of 6 months to a year. And that's why I do a little bits. We do an hour Well, this is like part of that program, but this one I let out for free. But we have three 1-hour sessions of talking about here's information on how to do it, here's how to consult to pick your options, and here's how to coach to convey those ideas. This is a long-term process. And in a sense, that's what Amplio is. It's not this my personal view. It's basically looking at the science and engineering of what's present, and then how can you apply it? And we're just putting the perspective of how can you explain it to people in a way that they can have more emotional attachment to solving their problems than emotional attachment to being safe. Now, my own opinion is a lot of people in this field are more attached to being safe, and I understand that. But you don't need everybody. You don't need everybody getting rid of it. You just need some of the team leads that can guide people and explain why. And this is the other part of systems thinking. You focus on the interrelationships between the pieces and start getting information on that. Okay, so I take it, I mean, I was expecting to get a lot of disagreement here. I'm assuming it worked out. Otherwise, you can ask me more about this. And I would like a little feedback. If anybody wants to offer some feedback about this, what you liked, what you didn't like, what I should do different next time, because there'll probably be a next time. And you can also send me an email later if you like. I'll be posting this up on the site. And I apologize for those of you in the, I did get a little behind in the Amplio COP. I did bring up the last session we missed a couple of sessions ago about MVIs. And I'll post the foundations one, which I'm not going to make public because that was kind of an odd one, but I'll be keeping up with it in the future. I guess what I want to know is if this was at least somewhat positive as to what we can do and not negative. I am trying to get to be more of a positive focus. So if you have any insights, please send me an email for it. I'm going to close this at this point. And thanks for being here. I don't know what I'm going to do next week, to be candid, but I think I might actually, I think it would be interesting to go through this process with the ACOP to see how understandable it is as a feedback validation for the ACEs who use this. This is a tool that the ACEs get. And this is how I actually used to do my own work. I used to go in for, I don't know, it was about 15 years. I did, no, I mean, not that long, 12, 13 years. I did consulting. And what I would do is I'd hand do it, but I would basically go in and create, well, how well are you doing here, then here, then here, then here, then here. And they would get all their challenges up here. And then we would talk about them and we'd see which ones were more important to solve, and we'd create an improvement path. And I think that's what we need. So there's that as well. Okay. I don't see any other hands. So I'm going to say goodbye and thanks for being here. I'll get this posted later today if you want to review it. And next week, yeah, I think I'm going to do that. I think we'll be ready. I want to get feedback from people who haven't been through the ACE program. So take care. Thanks again. Please do send me feedback. I'll always say thank you because that's good for me when I hear it, good or bad. Actually, it's more useful when it's not when it's negative feedback. So please don't be shy.